Hi everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're doing it slightly different today, slightly different setup. We're just recorded a video of some of our kind of most recent data trends rather than doing the full event. And we'll do a fuller event later on in the summer. But what we wanted to do was talk through some of the data that we're seeing coming into our service at Citizens Advice, particularly in the light of the war in the Middle East and the effect that that's having on prices, particularly of kind of domestic energy bills, and what that's doing to kind of people's budgets and what that's doing to people's kind of situation in terms of living standards. So it's a bit shorter, but we'll start where we always start, actually, which is with the kind of the long-term trends. So we've got a graph here which we often talk through, which it shows the number of people coming to us with cost of living issues since 2014. So it's going back way over a decade now. And, what we would always say is it really started as we came out of lockdowns and came out of COVID. But it's quite clear that, that our peak in terms of these numbers was in 2024, in January 24. So this is the highest number. And we see this for a few of our time series, actually, as we'll talk through them. And the most recent kind of winter that we've gone through was high in historical terms, but not as high as that. So in terms of cost of living type issues, way higher than we were 10 years ago, but not as high as we were in 2024, when for us it was kind of the peak of the crisis. So we can go on and we can look at this in a few different ways. So take energy affordability, right? So that's a decent place to start. You can see these numbers rising from January 21 onwards, then peaking in January 24. And where we are now, January 26, is roughly where we've been at this time of year for the last 3 or 4 years. So this kind of elevated high level of demand for our service, and you can see it there in terms of energy affordability. And if we move on, though, if you compare where we are now in 2026 month by month with 2022, I think it's quite instructive. 2022 is when we see the kind of the energy component of the cost of living crisis really kicking off. So that's when the war in Ukraine began. But it's worth remembering that the rise in prices didn't really happen until later in the year, right? And that's when we see the real surge in demand for our services. It's also when the government support kicked in, so people were trying to find out more about what they were entitled to. So we are much higher at the moment in terms of energy affordability advice than we were at the same time in 2022, but the rises in 22 came later in the year. I think it's probably worth, if we were to map that onto where we are now, it's probably worth, we would think we're at a higher level, but with the potential to rise later in the year. Should say this fall in April, probably don't read too much into that. In April, we've got Easter, they've got the bank holidays and the school holidays in April. And that always means that fewer people come to Citizens Advice. We're shut for a couple of days, and it means that people are kind of off doing other things. The numbers are always lower in April. They tend to bounce back in May, though. All right, let's go on. Let's look at food bank referrals. There's a slightly different trend here, actually, because it was a fairly steady rise it sort of pre-pandemic, and then there was activity sort of during 2020, during the pandemic year itself. And then just a really steep rise coming off the back of the lockdowns and into 21 and 22. Again, peaking in 2024, but we're at a really high level still in January 26, much higher than we were 4-5 years ago. And we can do the same trick where we just basically line up 2026 compared to 22, and we're just at an elevated level, about 10-15% higher than we were month on month in 2022. And it's worth noting again, we ended up in 22 higher than we began, so maybe we're going to see rises in the latter part of this year that we possibly haven't seen already. So we can move on to our next graph now, where we are going to look at negative budgets. So negative budgets is the concept that we've talked about quite a lot at these events. For our debt clients in particular, when they come in, we go through their incomes and their expenditures. And if their essential, sort of unavoidable expenditure is bigger than their income each month, then we say they're in a negative budget. There's more money going out than coming in. And that matters for debt clients, because if you've got more money going out than coming in, you can't pay your debts off, right? And, we started doing these presentations in summer 22, right about here. And really since then, we've been at fairly consistently high level of negative budgets. And we're at 52% of our debt clients have got more money going out than coming in every month. That's as high as it's ever been. And it compares to around about 37% in 2019, right, pre-COVID. So the numbers rose and they stayed high. And that's where you're kind of looking at kind of ongoing stock of problems that are hard to solve. Yeah, we look at number of people presenting with a problem, but we've also got like a situation here which is just not getting any better. And we can look at our debt data in a few different ways. This is the number of individuals who've come to us with a debt problem, right? So the most recent month is again as high as it's ever been on debt. Tend to peak in January because people come to us with their kind of like end of year kind of Christmas type debts that they've been trying to box off over the kind of festive period. But yeah, these debts are as high as they've ever been, and that's at least in part because energy debts in particular are as high as they've ever been. You see these spikes every January, particularly for energy debt, when in addition to the kind of Christmas factor that I just mentioned, you've got, you know, you're in the depths of winter, you're using the most energy you're going to use, and so the debts become the most problematic. So that's where we are on debts and energy debts in particular. And again, you can compare 2026 to 2022, and we are at a higher level month on month than we were in 2022. And that's for total debt, and you can see the same for energy debt too, right? So our overall position on things like debt and food bank usage is that it's higher than it was when we went into the last sort of energy price crisis. And this is a kind of slightly different way of presenting things. These lines are going to move around whilst I'm talking, but I think they show something quite interesting. We've pulled out 3 particular indicators here. People have come to us for food bank referrals, energy affordability advice, and energy debt advice. And the first 2 of those, they tend to move together, right? Often when people come for a food bank referral, we'll try and see whether there's any energy affordability advice we can give them. And they kind of move with each other. Sometimes one's higher than the other, but we can see they both peaked here in Jan 22. They're still high, but they've been higher. Whereas with energy debt, I mean, it's bumpy, this line, it's a bit spiky, but we're at a level now which is kind of as high as we've ever been on that particular series. So whilst the number is lower, the trend is slowly, slightly different for that particular indicator. And I want to just leave us off with a different way of thinking about people coming to Citizens Advice and the problems they present with, because we take quite a lot of information from you as well as we give out a lot of advice when people come to see us. So we know how many different issues did they come with. You know, did they come with a benefit problem and a housing problem, benefit problem and a debt problem? And this graph here, we're looking at the number of people who've come with different crisis problems, and we're showing how that has changed over the last 5 or 6 years, going back to 2019, 2020. So if you go back that far, about 4/5 of the people who came to us with a crisis problem only came with one problem, right? And it was very unlikely that people would come with 3 or more. Only 5% of people with a crisis problem had 3 or more. Whereas in the most recent year, around about 2/3 of people have come with only one problem, and 13% of people with a crisis problem have come with 3 or more. So you're getting this sort of densification of problems. So yeah, people are coming with more problems, and these problems are going to be harder to solve. And if you kind of put that alongside the debt graph we saw earlier of like basically people having less money to pay their debts off with, what you're seeing is, yeah, the number of people coming with a new problem every month goes up, comes down. That might have peaked, but the problems have kind of like silted up and like have stacked up now. So if you've got a problem, it's probably as deep as it ever has been. So these are the indicators we're going to be thinking about. These are the ones we're going to be looking at when we come to our next event, which will be in the early part of the summer. But yeah, thanks for watching the video, and yeah, look out for the invites for our next event. Bye.